We're on the bottom two lines of Mem Zayin Amud Beis. Just want to remind you that there's a standing machlokus here between Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri and the Chachamim, whether kelim are koine shvisa la'atzmam. What that means is that if you have an inanimate object that is ownerless, does it acquire its own domain as a non-sentient entity? It's based on our Mishnah, which talked about a person who's sleeping. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri says it is. It's kind of shvisa. Any object is limited by where it was at the inception of Shabbos, such that if it gets moved, if it gets brought into another tchum, you can't move it any further. It's stuck. According to the Chachamim, it's not kona shvisa because it's not. You need sentience in order to be kona shvisa at the inception of Shabbos. And as a result, when it's brought in from another place outside of the Chum and it's brought into a city, the people can use it, can move it. It's not limited by any Tchumen issues. Okay, so that's where we are. So Tani Rabbi Chia, Cherem shebein Tchumei Shabbos tzarech mechitza shel barzel lahafsiko. That Rabbi Chia taught a brisa. The brisa says, or he taught, that if you have a body of water that divides between two tchumim, between, let's say, two cities whose, like, imaginary line of their tchum, of their 2,000 amos outside their city, are abutting each other. And the point of connection is in the middle of the body of water. Let's say, for example, Lake Ontario, right? Which half is Canada and half of it is the United States. So let's say, if you could imagine the same idea of two tchumen, two borders of 2,000 amos that end at this exact meeting point. So the halacha is you need to set up an iron curtain, an iron wall, in order to divide the waters on one side from the waters on the other side. And ostensibly the reason appears to be that if you don't set up that iron wall, you won't be able to draw any water for yourself from that body of water, even while remaining inside your tchum, because of the principles of osmosis, the water from outside the tchum will flow into your side, and therefore you'll be drawing in water that's from outside your tchum. So the Gemara now says, "Mechayech alei Rabbi Yossi b'Rabbi Chanina, my time kamechayech." So Rabbi Yossi b'Rabbi Chanina, literally it means he smiled at this, which is a way of saying that, or almost like he grimaced at it in a mocking or a scoffing fashion. He says, "My time kamechayech." The Gemara says, why? Why did he react that way? Maybe it's because this brisa goes l'chumra like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, that inanimate objects are koine shvisa, they acquire their own boundaries. And he holds like the Rabbanan that that's not the case. So the Gemara says, "Umishum desaver lakula mandatani l'chumra mechayech alei." So the Gemara says, but why is that a reason to mock or to scoff at a brisa? Just because the brisa goes l'chumra like one tana, does that give you a right to mock it or scoff at it? So ela mishum detanya, but rather it's because of this, perhaps. The brisa says, "Naharos hamoshchin u'mayanos hanovin harein keraglei kol adam," that there's a special din by rivers, when flowing rivers and flowing well springs have the status, the brisa says, of any person who draws from it. They immediately go according to the person's tchum who drew that water. Mm-hmm. So you see that water is a special case. It doesn't have the same status as other inanimate objects according to everybody.
But how is it even practical?
We'll get to that in a second. So the Gemara says, "V'dilma b'michunasim," but rather says the Gemara says, but maybe that case over there that we say that it goes according to a person who draws the water is where you're talking about where the water was not flowing from before Shabbos, but rather it flowed into a gathered or collected area, and so that by the time Shabbos came in, the water was all collected in a pool already within my tchum, and that's the reason why it has the status of my tchum, because it was already collected and gathered. So Ela mishum de katani tzarach mechitza shel barzel lahafsiko. So, but rather the reason why he mocked it is because the Brisa said you need an iron curtain to divide the water. So, Maishna kanim delo, da aili behumaya, shel barzal nami aila behumaya. This goes to Bob's issue. Why do you need an iron curtain? Why can't you use a reed curtain? Why can't you use a curtain made out of reeds? Why? Because the water will flow in and out? Back and forth? Well, if that's the argument, then even with an iron curtain...
No, iron wouldn't let through.
No. So the Gemara's question is, we don't possess the technology in the times of the Gemara to hermetically seal a body of water in the middle to prevent any water from going back and forth from one to the other. Perhaps you could argue with 20th century technology like they do with the Panama Canal, maybe it's possible. But to say, to put up an iron curtain to seal off any seepage going from one side to the other, it doesn't seem to be practical at all. And certainly not if you're only just going to build a small partition. But Rashi says even if the partition goes all the way down to the riverbed, how are you going to be able to seal off a partition like that? The water, it's not practical. But the Gemara says, but maybe that's precisely what the Brisa means. It means to say that because you need to divide the water with an iron curtain, and such a thing is technologically impossible, therefore you're not allowed to draw water from this body of water on Shabbos on either side. Maybe that's what the Brisa means to say. So why is he mocking? Ela mishum dekalhu sheikelu chachamim b'mayim k'derebi tavla. The answer is because we know that there's a special leniency that the rabbis made by water, but when it comes to drawing water for personal use, because water is such an essential staple of life, the rabbis were lenient on the laws of Tchumen. And how do we know this? Because the question was raised that Reb Tavla asked Rav the following question. If a wall is suspended above ground and it does not go all the way down to the ground, does that act as a valid wall to create a courtyard that is partitioned and segregated, or does the wall need to go to the ground? So Amar Lei, Ein mechitza tluya materes ela b'mayim, kal hu sheikilu chachamim b'mayim. And Rav responded, no, a suspended wall only works for water. You may remember that we had a similar case of where a suspended wall works for water when we talked about a person who has a body of water right outside his window of his house. We said that he can create a bottomless box and suspend it over the water and then lower a bucket through the box to collect the water, even though the water is in a carmelis. We said that you're allowed to do that even though it's a suspended wall above ground. The reason is because the rabbis were lenient when it came to water. So if the rabbis were lenient in the case of water, so then it stands to reason that a mat or a curtain made out of reeds is all that you need. And that's why Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Chanina felt that this brisa was somewhat incorrect. You don't need an iron curtain. You just need some kind of partition, even a flimsy partition, which will allow the water to flow back and forth, and that for sure is going to still be okay.
Rabbi, there's a difference, though, in the case that you just mentioned previously, where you lowered it in the carpets because water was contained, whereas in a river or a lake or whatever, the water is continuously flowing.
Well, I understand. We're just using that as an illustration that a partition that is flimsy and doesn't accomplish the task that it's supposed to accomplish, which is to create a partition between water on both sides, the rabbi still said that it works. It's just by comparison. It's not the same case.
Is this supposed to be for a hecker, or it's not working?
Ostensibly, it's for a hecker. Yes.
What's
right.
a hecker?
It's just a recognizable symbol that you can't go beyond this place to get water. V'chachamim omrim ein lo ela arba v'chulai. Now, let's go back to our Mishnah. The Mishnah goes all the way back to DAF Mem Hey Amud Aleph on the bottom. We saw a four-way machlokes about a person who is sleeping when Shabbos comes in. And he's out in the middle of nowhere, and he's sleeping when Shabbos comes in. So the problem is that because he is not sentient, he's not conscious at the time when Shabbos comes in, is he Kona Shvisa or not? So Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri says that he is Kona Shvisa because even non-sentient items can be Kona Shvisa, so he has 2,000 amas in all directions. The Chachamim say that no, he only has Arba amos because he wasn't Kona Shvisa. And Rabbi Eliezer says, I agree with the Chachamim that he's only koina arba amos, but the arba amos is not a 4 amma radius, but it's rather a 4 amma diameter, which means he has a 2 amma radius. And then the fourth opinion was Rabbi Yehuda, which we need to analyze. He says, Le'ezer ruach sheyirtze yelech, you can go in any direction you want, dalet amos, which sounds like he's saying exactly like the Chachamim, which is that you have a 4 amma radius and not a 4 amma diameter. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Yehuda hainu tanakama. What's the difference between Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim? How is he saying any differently? Amar Rava shmona al shmona ika beinayu. The machlokes is, when we say that you have a 4 amma radius, basically that means you can draw a circle around you, an imaginary circle, that has a radius of 4 amos, and then also you square it off. So you gain the additional corners. Basically, you create a circle that is bounded by a square. So you have an 8 by 8 area where you're in the midpoint of the square. And that's what we allow you to have according to the Chachamim. And Rabbi Yehuda says, no, you only have 4 amos of a radius in one direction. Not in all directions, but in one direction. If I want to go north 4 amos, then I cannot go south at all. If I want to go 2 amos north, I can go 2 amos south. If I want to go 1 amma north, I can go 3 amos south, but I don't have a radius that goes all around me of 4 amos. That's the machlokes between Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim. So, Tanya Nami Hachi, Yesh Lo Shmona Al Shmona Divrei Reb Meir. The Raizel supports that Reb Meir is like the Tanakama, who says you have 8 by 8, which is like the radius of 4 bounded by a square. Amar Rava machlokes lahalech avol letaltel divrei hakol arba amos in tfeilo. Furthermore, Rava says the machlokes is only as far as what area you're allowed to traverse with your feet. You're allowed to go according to the Chachamim 8 by 8. But when it comes to the movement of an object, if you move the object 4 amos that is with you on Shabbos 4 amos to the north, then the Chachamim agree to Rabbi Yehuda that you cannot move it at all to the south. Right? You're stuck with only a window of 4 amos in one direction. You can't bring it back to you and then say, okay, I'm going to stop here and then I'm going to move it south 4 amos. No, that doesn't work. So now the question is, this is a very general question. Where do we know this principle that even when a person does not have 2,000 amos, he always has at a minimum 4 amos? Where does this measurement of 4 amos come from? Kidetanya shavu ish tachtav. Because the Torah says when it introduces the laws of Shabbos in Parshas B'Shalach, it says each person shall dwell underneath himself. Now what does that word underneath himself mean? Ketachtav. That every Shabbos you automatically have a domain of the measurement that is beneath you. The kama tachtav gufo shalosh amos va'ama kedei lifshat yadav v'raglav divrei meir. And how much is that? Just imagine a person standing and then falling to the ground and lying down. So that's what it means, tachtav, to beneath yourself, which means when you're falling down on the ground, you have 4 amos. Why? Because the average human height is 3 amos, and you have an additional amma to stretch out your hand in all directions, even above your head. Well, that will make a total of 4 amos from your fingertips to your toes.
And if you haven't got enough room to move around.
That's right. So
you're just standing. Or
right.
lying, actually.
So lying is right, but then you couldn't move anymore. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Gufo Shalosh Amos VaAma Kedei Sheyitol Chayfetz Mitachas Margalosa VaMinach Tachas Mira'ashosav. And Rabbi Yehuda says that the 4 amos is measured by when a person is lying down and he needs to grasp an object that is underneath his feet and move it to underneath his head. So that's the amount of room you have, because through the arm movement you're going to end up with an extra amma. So the Gemara says, "My beinayu." They seem to be saying the same thing. You need to account for the length of the arm. So the Gemara says, "Ika beinayu arba amos mitzum samos." The answer is that no. For Rabbi Meir, when a guy wants to stretch his arms like that, goes like he's yawning or whatever, that's a much more expansive 4 amos. That's a very generous 4 amos. Whereas if you're just allowing you to lie down and not really stretch out your hand like that, but just to grab something underneath your feet and move it to underneath your head, it's a more limiting movement of your arm, and therefore it's a very, very precise 4 amos without any leeway.
Did anybody ever get stuck like this?
I imagine so.
How do you bathroom? How do you do it?
Well,
Sounds pretty awesome.
Well, when you're in a desolate area, I guess you do what you got to do.
You gotta go.
Yeah, just don't go in the wind, okay? Amarle Rav Misharshia Libre.
Back up, Steve.
You know, to do the wind test. Okay, Amarle Rav Misharshia Libre, Ki Eilis Lekame de Rav Papa Be'imine. So he says to his son, Rav Misharshi, he says, when you go to learn Torah by Rav Papa, I want you to ask him the following question. Arba amal sha'amru ba'ama didei yavinan lei o ba'ama shel kodesh yavinan lei. When we talk about this measurement of a 4 radius or diameter, is it measured based upon his arm length, which is what an amma is? It's the distance between your elbow to the tip of your middle finger, and therefore it's individualized based upon the person. So do we base it on his amma and his body size, or is there an absolute measurement using the amma measurement that was used to build the Beis HaMikdash, the measuring stick that was used to build the Beis HaMikdash? So im amar lecha amo shel kodesh yavinan lei og melech habashan matehei alav. So if he tells you that we use absolute measurements, well then what's a guy that's the size of Og Melech Habashan, was a giant, what is he going to do when he gets stuck out in the wilderness for Shabbos? He won't even be able to inhale, because by the time he inhales, his whole body will move more than 4 amos. So what's he supposed to do? Vim omer lecha ba'ama didei yavinan lei, ema lei my time alo ketani la gabe yesha amru hakol lefi mashu adam. And if he tells you it's subjective, individualized, based upon the person's own body measurements, so then ask him the question, why then is this halacha not listed among a whole series of halachas that are listed in Maseches Kelim that talk about halachos where the measurement is subjective, based upon the size of the person performing the mitzvah. So for example, one of the things that is listed in that Mishnah Kelim is the mitzvah of Kemitza. When the Kohen scoops up the fistful of flour, what is a fistful? And so there the Mishnah says it's subjective based upon the size of the Kohen that's doing the Kemitza, etc. So this should be listed in that Mishnah as well. So Ki asa lekame de Rav Papa amar le. So when he came to Rav Papa said to him as follows, I daikinan kule hai lo havi tanina. So it's a little bit cryptic exactly what Rav Papa means. And I've been thinking about what exactly Rav Papa means, but it seems to me that he's saying that if we were to limit ourselves to categorize that a halacha either is subjective or objective in its measurements, then we wouldn't be able to properly learn. We wouldn't be able to come up with any solid conclusions, because ultimately what we're going to see is that this is an example of where it's a little bit of both. And why is that? So he explains as follows. Because la'olam, and like Rashi, if you take a look at Rashi, Rashi says, that, if we're going to be this precise with all other places in Shas where similar questions arise, sometimes we're going to get stuck and we won't be able to peg ourselves in one camp or the other. Because as you'll see in a moment, this is an example of where sometimes we have to use subjective measurements, and sometimes we have to use objective measurements. So what do we mean? He says, because la'olam ba'amadidei yahavinan lei. Because really, we use a subjective amma based upon his body size. He says the reason why we couldn't list it in the Mishnah in Kalim, which lists all subjective halachas that are based on subjective measurements, is because there are certain times when a person is a midget and his body, the torso size is the size of a normal human being, and his limbs are stunted. And therefore, for such a person to only limit him to the size of his personal arm length is unfair. You can't do it, because the rest of his body is the size of a normal human being. And that's where we would give him the objective amma size because of his personal disability or his special body structure. But with a person who's got proportionate limbs to his body, then we go according to his body size. Okay, let us go on. The Mishnah had now listed a series of cases. One case was if two people are outside in the wilderness, each one has 4 amos, and let's say they're 6 amos apart from each other, so they have an overlap there are two radii overlapped for 2 items. So the Mishnah had said that they're allowed to share items that are in that overlap space, and they can eat in that overlap space, provided that the person, Reuven and Shimon, Reuven is not going to take Shimon's stuff and bring it outside of the intersecting area, and Shimon is not going to take Reuven's stuff and take it outside of the intersected area towards him. And then Reb Shimon had said, then the Mishnah said another halacha, if you have 3 people, Reuven, Shimon, and Levi, Reuven's in the east, and Levi is in the west, and Shimon is in the middle. And each one of them overlaps. So Reuven overlaps with Shimon 2 amos, Shimon overlaps with Levi 2 amos, so then Reuven and Shimon are allowed to share, Shimon and Levi are allowed to share, but Reuven and Levi are not allowed to share, because they're not overlapping at all with each other. And then Reb Shimon comes along and he says, Lama hadavar doimeh. He says, you know what this is analogous to? This is analogous when you have 3 courtyards all adjacent to each other. You have an eastern courtyard, a western courtyard, and a middle courtyard dividing between the 2. So the halacha is that if all of them make an eruv with all of them, so then you can carry from one to the other indiscriminately. It's perfectly fine. But let's say the eastern eruv makes an eruv with the middle, and the western eruv makes an eruv with the middle one. So then the eastern chutzer and the middle chutzer are allowed to share items back and forth. The middle chutzer and the western chutzer are allowed to share items back and forth. But objects from the western chutzer are not allowed to make their way to the eastern chutzer, and vice versa. You cannot carry items that are from the eastern chutzer all the way to the western chutzer, and vice versa. Okay, why? Because they didn't make an eruv with each other. They only incorporated with the middle chutzer. So the Gemara now, that Reb Shimon uses that analogy. So the Gemara now says, why was it necessary for Reb Shimon to say that this is analogous to anything? Why didn't he just accept the halacha? What's the difference between when you have 3 intersecting individuals or 3 courtyards that are adjacent to each other? Hachi ka'amar lahu Reb Shimon l'Rabbanan. Mechti l'mahador v'doime l'shalosh chatzeros hapsuchos zulazu psuchos l'rishus harabim. Ma'ishna hasam de palgisa u'ma'ishna hacha de lo palgisa. The answer is that Reb Shimon was addressing the Chachamim whom he knew disagreed with this halacha. The Chachamim say that while we agree when you have 3 people adjacent to each other, then Reuven can share with Shimon, and Levi can share with Shimon, but Reuven may not share with Levi. As we'll see momentarily at the end of today's DAF, there's a sheet of the Chachamim who say, but when you have courtyards that are like that, not only can the east not share with the west, but the east may not share with the middle, and the west may not share with the middle. So Reb Shimon says, I don't understand. Why is it different? If you hold that you can share, Reuven can share with Shimon and Levi can share with Shimon, then why do you say that it's usher for the eastern courtyard to share with the middle, and for the western courtyard to share with the middle? So the Chachamim answer, V'Rabbanan hasam abshi diyurin, hachalo abshi diyurin. The answer is simple, say the Chachamim. There's no control possible to prevent items from migrating from the eastern courtyard to the western courtyard and vice versa when you're dealing with multiple inhabitants. And as a result, they made a general policy and they said that unless all the chutzers have made an eruv with each other, we do not allow movement of items from the eastern courtyard to the middle courtyard, or from the western courtyard to the middle courtyard, or vice versa, because we're worried that if we allow that, then eventually kalim that come from the east will go all the way to the west, because there's no way to control it since there's so many different people. But when you only have 3 people and they're all watching over each other, so then it's possible to control it and make sure that they're not going to make a mistake, that Reuven's stuff will end up in Levi's domain. And that's the reason why the Chachamim make this distinction. And this is really a machlokus between Reb Shimon and the Chachamim. Reb Shimon says that there's no difference between individuals and 3 chatzeros, and the Chachamim say, yes, there is a difference between the 2. Then the Mishnah had said that the 2 outer chatzers, the eastern and the western, may not share with each other since they didn't make an eruv with each other. So frek the Gemara va'amai, but why should that be so? Kevin da'arvi lahu chitzonos b'hadayim soyis havi lahu chada. The Gemara's havamin at this point is that we know that how do you incorporate 2 chatzers together? The members of each chatzar have to contribute to a container of food, and once they have this container of food that is jointly owned, it becomes an incorporated entity. The two chutzers now become like one entity. So the Gemara's assumption is that the people of the eastern courtyard and the people of the western courtyard contributed food to a place in the middle courtyard where all the food is together. So I don't understand, says the Gemara, if they all contributed to the same pot, even though the people of the east and the people of the west did not officially join forces, but once they contribute all to the same container, so then de facto it should be one corporate entity. So why is it that the east and the west can't make an eruv with each other? So, or that they don't have the same tchum? So Amar Rav Yehuda kagon shenasna emsoyis eruva bezu ve'eruva bezu. So Rav Yehuda gives a very simple answer. You're mistaken. It's not that the people in the east and the west gave their contributions of food to a local, to a centralized container in the middle chutzner, but just the opposite. The people in the middle chutzner gave of their food. Some of it they gave to the people in the east, some of it they gave to the people in the west. So there's 2 boxes of matzahs instead of 1 box of matzah. There's 1 box of matzah in the eastern courtyard that is shared by the people in the east and the people in the middle. And there's another box of matzah that's in the western courtyard that's shared by the people in the west and the people in the middle. And therefore you don't have a joint eruv from all the courtyards. Rav Sheshis Amar, Rav Sheshis disagrees. He says, Afilu tema shenasnu eruvan be'emsoyis. He says, even if you say that everyone, there's only 1 box of, that there's, everyone gave their matzahs or their bread pieces to a container in the center, however, kegon shenasnuhu b'shtei batim. But there still is 2 boxes of matzah. There's 1 box of matzah in 1 house in the middle courtyard, and another box of matzah in another house in the middle courtyard, and that's why they're not considered incorporated. So the Gemara now says, Keman ke Beis Shammai. So you seem to be going like Beis Shammai. The Tanya chamisha shegavu es eruvan benasnuhu b'shnei kelim. Beis Shammai omrim ein eruvan eruv, Beis Hillel omrim eruvo eruv. That there's a machlokus between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. If you have 5 people that live in 1 courtyard, and they want to incorporate the courtyard, and they gather up, each one gives a piece of food. If the 3 people put their food in 1 container, and 2 of the 5 put their food in another container, Beis Shammai say that that's not a valid eruv, because it has to be all in 1 container. And Beis Hillel say it's still a valid eruv, even if it's in 2 separate containers. So the Gemara says, according to you, Rav Sheshis, you seem to be going like Beis Shammai. And that's improbable, because we never paskin like Beis Shammai over Beis Hillel, so how can that be? So the Gemara says no. Afilu tema Beis Hillel ad kan lo kamri Beis Hillel hasam elo b'shnei kelim b'vayis echad, aval b'shnei batim lo. The Gemara says no. Even Beis Hillel agree that if the 2 boxes of matzahs are in 2 separate houses, which are 2 separate home-owned domains, even Beis Hillel agree that that's not considered to be 1 unified eruv. The only time that Beis Hillel disagree with Beis Shammai is if you have 2 boxes of matzah in the same house. 2 boxes of matzah in the same house are part of 1 collective because they're in the same structure, in the same domain. And therefore they count as 1 eruv. But if you have 2 boxes of matzahs in 2 separate houses, even Beis Hillel agree that that's not called 1 eruv. And that's why the east cannot transfer to the west and vice versa. So Amalei Rav Acha Bereder Rav Ivya Rav Ashi, Rav Yehuda Kasha, Ula Rav Sheshis Kasha. He says that I have a problem with both Rav Yehuda's pshat, who said that we're talking about where the eruvs, the food parcels, are deposited in the eastern and western courtyards respectively. And I have a kasha according to Rav Sheshis, who says the 2 parcels of food are in the middle courtyard but in 2 separate houses. The Rav Yehuda kasha, Damar Kagon Shenasno Imsois Eruva Bezu Ve'eruva Bezu, the Kaven the Irva Imsois Ba'di Chitzona Havilechada V'chihadra Ve'irva Ba'hadi Idach Shlichusa Avda. Here's my question according to Rav Yehuda, who says that the people in the center put their food in a container in the east, and they put their other food in a container in the west. Here's my problem, says the Gemara. Once the people in the middle incorporate with the people in the east by putting their food in 1 parcel, then they de facto become 1 corporate entity, 1 halachic entity. And then when the people in the middle then take their food and give it over to the people in the west, basically they're representing not only themselves but all of the members of that corporate entity. So therefore, according to Rav Yehuda, why is it not now in a completely incorporated entity of all three chatzeros together? That's my question on Rav Yehuda's pshat. And my question on Rav Shesh's pshat is coming from the other direction. Rav Shesh's kasha tihabi kechamisha sheshruyin bechatzer echas v'shachach echad mehen v'lo iriv de asri ahadadi. My question, according to Rav Shesh's, is Rav Shesh's, you say that because they put their food parcels in two separate houses, therefore they're not considered to be one eruv. Well, then not only do you have a problem of east going to the middle and west going to the middle, but even the people in the middle courtyard should not be allowed to carry at all, because now you have two separate entities, two separate corporate entities within one chutzner. It's no different from when you have 5 people in one chutzner and only 4 people contribute to the eruv and one person does not. Just like in that situation, when you have 2 halachic entities, neither entity can carry. The same thing should be true in here. Since you have 2 sets of eruvs, is as if you made no eruv at all. Because the only way that you can carry is if you have if one singular entity for everyone. But if you have 2 separate entities, some for the people in the east and the middle courtyard, and some people in the west and middle courtyard, then it's as if you have no eruv at all. So that's the kasha that I have in Rav Shesh's. It shouldn't be allowed to carry at all. Right? So the Gemara says, Amar le Rav Ashi, lo le Rav Yehuda kasha, velo le Rav Shesh's kasha. So he answers like this. It's not shver on Rav Yehuda, and it's not shver on Rav Shesh's. And I'll explain to you why. The Rav Yehuda lo kasha, kevin di irvala imtsoyis bahadi chitzona, ushtaim chitzonis bahadi hadari lo irvu, galia daite de bahanichale uvahalo. The answer is, you had suggested that when the middle courtyard incorporates with the east, and then afterwards they incorporate with the west, since at the time when they incorporated with the west there was one corporate entity of middle and east, so therefore it should all be one happy family. He says, no. You know why that doesn't work? Since the people in the east did not at all contribute to the food container that's going in the west, they have actively demonstrated that they do not have any desire of having any corporate connections with the people in the west. Because they've revealed that, then the people in the middle courtyard cannot act as their proxies to incorporate. Because that's sort of an active demonstration. By refusing to participate in the eruv in the west, that's an active demonstration that we don't want to incorporate with the people in the west.
They couldn't make the middle people shlichim?
They could if they actively designate them, but they didn't. That's the whole point. The people in the middle cannot take it upon themselves to act as their shlichim. The people in the east have to either designate them as their shlichim or they have to contribute the food. But if they don't contribute the food, it's not going to work. And that's why they can only carry from the east to the middle and from the west to the middle, but not from the east to the west.
How could they contribute the food? They're on the other side, technically.
Well, no. This is all before Shabbos.
I understand.
This is all before Shabbos.
If there's a chutzner between me and the guy across the neck, what would it logically mean if I'm giving it to that guy?
No, because once I incorporate with the people in the east, then I'm part of one entity which is adjacent now to the western courtyard. So if they would actively give up some of their food to the people in the west, they could incorporate everything. But it doesn't work that way.
Maybe they forgot.
Even if they forgot, forgetting is not an excuse. If you don't do it, you don't have an eruv.
Okay.
Well, Rav Shesh's lo kasha, and now why is it not a problem for Rav Shesh's? It's not a problem for Rav Shesh's. Why? What did we challenge recently? According to Rav Shesh's, you have 2 corporate entities in one chutzner, and that sort of makes it like you have no eruv at all. So he says, Im amru diyurin lahakel, yomru diyurin lahachmir? Question mark. The answer is as follows. In a real sense, the only people that are living in the middle chutzner are the people who are actually occupying that space. They have all incorporated with each other. What you're arguing is the fact that the people from the west have contributed some of their food, and the people from the east have contributed some of their food, makes it now like we have 2 corporate entities that are not consistent with each other, and therefore they prevent the eruv being in the middle chutzner at all from working. But that's not true, because the only time that we consider someone from another chutzner to be part of this chutzner is as a leniency. The only time we consider someone that's residing in another chutzner to be part of this chutzner because they contribute food is only as a leniency to create an incorporated entity. But to be machmir and say that by you giving me food, it's like you're living here, and therefore you are an impediment to the Eruv, that we don't say. It's only lekula that we say that your food makes as if you're here. But lechumra, giving your food, doesn't make it as if you're here. So the fact that you've given your food here does not impede the ability for the people in the middle Chatzer to be one corporate entity unto themselves. And therefore they're allowed to carry, and because they've incorporated with the two outer Chatzers, they can carry back and forth from the outer to the inner, but not from the outer to the outer. Okay, so now the Gemara says, let's just finish this off. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav Zu Divrei Reb Shimon. So Rav Yehuda says in the name of Rav something that we had alluded to before, that this whole halacha, that the middle Chatzer can carry to the two outers and vice versa, but the outer cannot carry to the other outer, is only according to Reb Shimon. Abal Chachamim Omrim Rishus Echas Mishameshes L'Shtei Rishuyos Abal Lo Shtei Rishuyos Mishamshos L'Rishus Echas. According to the Chachamim, only the people in the two outer Chatzers are allowed to transport their utensils into the middle Chatzer, but you cannot transport items in the middle Chatzer to either of the outer Chatzers. Now let's explain why that is. I'll say that one more time. Only items that are in the two outer Chatzers can be moved into the middle Chatzer. But items that are in the middle Chatzer may not be transported to the outer Chatzer, to either outer Chatzer. Why? Because since items that are in the middle Chatzer are part of a tug of war, a conceptual tug of war between the two outer Chatzers, the fact that the people in the east have dibs also on the utensils that are in the middle Chatzer prevents those items from being transported to the west and vice versa. In other words, when there's a courtyard where only the members of that courtyard have dibs on that item, plus the people that they made an Eruv with, right? So then you can move it back and forth. But when you have items in a Chatzer where two separate incorporated entities claim dibs on that, so then those items are prevented from moving to either mutually exclusive Chatzer.
Even if they're owned by the middle people.
They're owned by the middle people. But there's a tug of war conceptually that's taking place between the eastern Chatzer and the western Chatzer for the rights on those Kalim, and so they can't move in either direction. So in the Gemara it says, Ki Amrisa Kamei de Shmuel, Amar Li, Apsu Diva Reb Shimon. So when I said this to Shmuel, that the Chachamim disagree with Reb Shimon, he told me that no, even Reb Shimon agrees to that Chumrah, that the items in the middle Chatzer cannot move to the outer Chatzers. Abal Chachamim Omrim Shloshten Asuros. But the Chachamim are of the opinion that all three Chatzers are Asur. The fact that the Eastern did not make an Eruv with the Western precludes all utensils from being moved to any Chatzer other than themselves. That's the sheet of the Chachamim, because if you didn't make an Eruv with all three, then everything is going to be Asur. We'll explain it more thoroughly tomorrow and bring proofs to either side. We'll hold it here for today. Have a wonderful day.